Joining us from Litquake is Maris Dyer.
Thanks for coming to I Watch the World 30 Years After Brautigan, which is part of this year's Litquake Literary Festival. I'm Maris from the Litquake Committee, and welcome to our 15th anniversary year. Our programming wouldn't be possible without the help of our sponsors. So among them are Minor Anderson Family Foundation, the Grants for the Arts, Fora TV, Blurb, and National Endowment for the Arts. And the festival would certainly not exist without the generosity of so many individuals, meaning all of you guys. If you believe in keeping literature a key component of the city's cultural landscape, we encourage you to become Litquake members. And we encourage you to go to all of the festival events, which continue through Saturday, October 18th. Most of them are free, so please check them out in our programs, which we have on that desk over there and there as well. And we also have some free bookmarks too. And they're online on our new website, litquake.org. So tonight's event is co-presented by our good friends at Bancroft Library, and yeah. And we thank them also for helping spread the word about Litquake and all the other exciting events we have going on this week. So let's get started. And here is our host for the evening, Stephen Black.
Good evening. Perhaps the words will remember me. Something Brautigan once wrote. And looking around, I can see not just the words, but plenty of people are here to join in that recollection. All those tents that are left over from homecoming weekend put me in mind of the Invisible Circus, which is another moment in Brautigan's life that is interesting to remember. After titling this event, I actually thought another title that might well draw from the same Brautigan poem that is being used for the short film we're showing later this evening, which is You Will Have Unreal Recollections of Me. Which he dedicated to Rilke. You will have unreal recollections of me like half-developed photographs for all the days of your life, even though you have never met me, because I have dreamt you. Soon it will be morning, the dream over. Well, welcome everyone to Berkeley, and thanks for joining us here on Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm just curious to know how many people are here because this is Litquake. Hands up. Okay. How many people have university connections here? All right. And how many of you knew Richard Brautigan either personally or directly? All right. Well, we've got a pretty good sampling. So this evening we're going to hear from his friends, his colleagues, and family. The library is delighted to be hosting this celebration of Richard Brautigan and to have assembled a number of poets who are near and dear to Richard. Representatives of the Orphic Muse, channelers of meat science, jazz poetry, Japanese influences, North Beach, the Berkeley and San Francisco Renaissance artists, many of whom had connections to Cal. It is a thrill to be gathering in this most beautiful of library spaces, the Morrison Room. At the back is a poetry alcove containing books collected by Josephine Miles, who was a distinguished poet and English department professor who provided much support and encouragement to the poets who became known as the Berkeley Renaissance. That was Jack Spicer, Robert Duncan, and Robin Blazer, before and after they moved across the bay and were thence known as the San Francisco Renaissance. She was an early supporter of Brautigan's work and, among other considerations, recommended him for a Guggenheim Fellowship. Some housekeeping announcements. In an ideal arrangement, this event would be a day-long or longer symposium, but to pull this off at this point in time, we are operating with what we have, and quite a potlatch it is. So the library does close at 9 o'clock, and this program will end by 8:30. We have a lot packed into this evening. If anyone is looking for an after party, I could suggest Jupiter Pub down on Shattuck, just a few doors south of Center Street. But to discuss or make a concerted plan, I'd suggest that you meet outside the north doors after the event, a big wide open space, and let 100 flowers bloom. A number of shout outs before we continue. First to the Library Development Office staff, especially Dave Dewar and Gigi Gillard. Juju in the University Librarian's Office, and all my colleagues, too many to name, in Bancroft, without whom this program would just be an unrealized dream. Thanks also to Moe's Bookshop, and poet, bookseller Owen Hill, who's back there for bringing books for sale, and please pay him a visit. We also give thanks to Jeff Mazer, who provided the Brautigan flyer broadside, the San Francisco weather report that is there as a gift to you. It is a fragile and ephemeral item, so if you take it, make sure you get one of the file folders to carry it safely in. Now, an inevitable reminder about technology. I silenced my device. Have you silenced yours? Now is a good time to check. It certainly does recall Brautigan's prophetic, all watched over by machines of loving grace. And do observe the fact that we have one commissioned audiovisual document being made of this program, and let's have that be the document. I'd like to get off the stage as quickly as possible, make way for our guests. I have a few minutes to talk just generally about Richard Brautigan. It was my hope and intention to speak of some of the unique Brautigan materials that are here in the library's collection, but as the program filled, I found myself chopping, so that overview will have to wait for another time. We are honored to have with us Richard Brautigan's daughter, Ianthe, and her husband, Paul Swensen. They will screen a short film that that she and Paul made, and we will follow with some people that I will introduce who knew Richard Brautigan, and that part of the program will have a succession of speakers at the podium, limited to 3 minutes each. And I do have a colleague with a little red sign with the number 3 on it, so if you go over 3 minutes, you'll hopefully see Nathan. After that, we'll pull back the podium and assemble the chairs. Well, we have the chairs here for a panel of poets who will be introduced and poetically immoderated by our poet laureate, Robert Hass. And there will be time for a question and answer. Litquake's calendar has provided a timely window on our recent past. Its quinceañera, or 15th birthday, doubles down at a time in a season of remembrance that is traditionally a time that the membrane between the world of the living and the dead is often felt to be thinnest. Maybe it's the smell of sage in the air or the blood of a harvest moon. It was in mid-September 1984 that Richard Brautigan took his life, and as a sign of how withdrawn he had become by his 49th year, it was not until late in October that the worst fears about his lengthening absence were confirmed. The humor, the unflinching revelation of the foibles of life and living in a time of swift social and technological change make it difficult to separate the man from his work. There is a logic to having this event at the library. First off, well, Bancroft is the archival home for many of his papers, and we salute Richard Brautigan as an American original, a true writer of the West, who even with a life truncated left a remarkable body of work that merits and rewards consideration by new readers and old. If we had more time, I would love to muse at length on the uneasy resignation to modern technology that one reads and which resonates today in his work. The publication of the biography of Brautigan by William Yortzberg a few years ago provides a substantial package of information about the writer and his milieu. It describes a man who came to San Francisco as soon as he was able, a man in some ways reminiscent of Jack London's Martin Eden or Ken Kesey's Randall Patrick McMurphy. Once arrived, he found little employment and managed to make ends meet by searching for loose change, selling his blood, and even being a bicycle messenger delivering telegrams for Western Union in the financial district. Among his earliest poetic comrades, who he met outside the Place, which was a legendary gathering point in North Beach, was, I'm not paying that close attention to my slides, was Ron Lowenson. And here Richard is pictured with Ron Lowenson on the cover of their short-lived one-issue periodical Change, which came out, I believe, in 1964. They met in 1956. I was really hoping Ron would be able to join us today. They met in '56 in North Beach and developed concurrently under some of the same influences, although Ron Lowenson's path led to a career in academia, with 35 years in Cal's English department, publication of a number of notable books of poetry, and the novel Magnetic Fields. Among the people I discussed Richard Brautigan with in recent times, Herb Gold made an interesting comment about how, for him, the book of Richard's that really summed up what was happening in the Bay Area in 1968 was this one, Please Plant This Book. I believe that's the Ianthe on the cover.
No, it's not me.
It's not you?
But it led to me being on another cover
Okay.
of a book because I complained bitterly.
Okay. All right, more on that later. This was not Ianthe, but somebody else. And the book was not intended for sale. It was free. The distribution of it was for free only. And its contents were seed packets with a poem on each packet and instructions for planting each of the different flowers. This one, Sweet Alyssum Royal Carpet. I've decided to live in a world where books are changed into thousands of gardens, with children playing in the gardens and learning the gentle ways of green growing things. Or this one. There was one, California Native Flowers. In this spring of 1968, with the last third of the 20th century traveling like a dream towards its ends, it is the time to plant books, to pass them into the ground so that flowers and vegetables may grow from these pages. As I mentioned, there's much else that could be said by way of introduction, but I'm going to end here and yield the podium to Ianthe. Ianthe Brautigan-Swensen is an American writer and daughter of the late author Richard Brautigan. Her parents separated when she was 2, and she spent most of her young life with her father. Her book, You Can't Catch Death, A Daughter's Memoir, was published in the year 2000. It has been translated into many languages and will soon be available from audiblebooks.com. She teaches at Sonoma State University, where in the 1990s she studied with instructor of mathematics, being our free speech champion, Mario Savio. And let's everyone give a warm welcome to Ianthe.
Hi, do you want to come up for a second? So I'm going to make this really, really short because we have a lot to do tonight. And I just wanted to first thank Litquake and the Bancroft Library. Stephen Black and Jack Bower of Litquake cooked up this idea, and Stephen Black has curated what I feel to be is going to be a wonderful experience. I thought kind of long and hard about what my dad would have thought about this. And the conclusion that I came to is that the people here, David Meltzer, Joanne Kyger, Michael McClure, Robert Haas, represent a kind of writing that is extraordinary and magical. And that was what he literally lived and died for, was the magic of words. And these people in particular, he loved them. And he was a difficult friend, but he did love them very much. And he loved their work. And it'll be so interesting to hear their reflections about their time. And I'm going to have my husband explain, and I wanted to give a shout out to my Sonoma State pals who came all the way, because they're amazing. Anyway, so Paul's going to
explain this?
Yes, you're going to explain this. And thanks to Paul, because
Good evening.
He was just directing over in Jacques Pepin over in San
From
Francisco.
food television to Brautigan in one Uber car. There is a documentary. It's a very, very long documentary right now. Literally scores of interviewees. In fact, David Meltzer, Joanne are two of the many people. We've gone from California.
Ishmael Reed.
Ishmael's, oh yeah, where are you? I saw him a minute ago.
There he is.
There he is, hey. We've gone to Montana, to Paris, to the East Coast, to the backwoods of Virginia, to Japan, San Francisco Bay Area, obviously, Oregon, gathering interviews from first-person relations as well as young people who seem to still be reading his books with great enthusiasm. We have movie stars and amazing writers and very kind and generous people, most of which had something to say about Richard. A lot of it is very positive. In fact, when it comes to many of the stories, it's quite heartwarming to hear their stories. However, there are people who can divide his life into then, before, and the end, which would tend to be a little less rosy, and yet Jim Harrison is my favorite interview right now. Everything he says, we could make a 30-minute film just with Jim. So this is what I affectionately titled Swept from the Cutting Room Floor. There are elements in this that will appear in the documentary. However, there are other things that we just thought were so interesting and may not make the final cut that we wanted to include them just for tonight. It's about 15 minutes of material put together. So what I'd say is this is not the documentary. It's going to be out, I think, in about 18 months. We're not quite there, and we have quite a bit of publicity to do around it. I co-direct this documentary with Anthony Lucero, a good friend who lives in Los Angeles and has interviewed many of the people. It's produced by many people, about 6, one of which is Ianthe. So I hope you enjoy this.
Well, thank you, Paul and Ianthe. That was wonderful. Yes. And we're the first ones to see it. Thank you very much. So before we bring the panel out, there are a few friends of Richard that we'd like to invite to speak for a few minutes. I wonder if Ishmael Reed is in the room?
You guys need a helicopter to bring people up the steps. Took me a half hour to get up the steps. I have very selfish reasons. I decided that if I was going to survive as a writer, I had to go into exile, and Richard Brautigan was the one who led me there. Because in this country, you get these adjectives that sort of like are albatrosses, like minority writer, black writer. I was able to break out of that because of Richard Brautigan, whom I met in 1967. Jinx Hone, who was the East Coast representative for Doubleday Books, asked me which writers I'd like to have as guests for this book luncheon I had at Enrico's. Remember Enrico's? And I asked for Richard Brautigan. I had read its fiction and was struck by its originality. I hadn't read anything like it before or since. Fiction writers are among the most conservative of artists, and that's why formalistically most novels read as though they were written by the same person. I hate to say that. Brian Geisen said, who was William Burroughs' mentor, said that fiction is 50 years behind painting. We saw each other on and off after that. He was a guest in our home. And this is amazing because some guy from the BBC interviewed me recently about Tom Gunn, who was a professor here. I was his roommate or his office mate for years. I never got that side of him. You know, this guy's a motorcycle, some kind of guy riding around at night. He's a very conventional person, and I don't recognize Richard Brautigan in this gossip, this stuff that's coming, these tabloid things that are coming out. So we saw each other, and he was a guest in our home in New York and Berkeley, and my partner, Carla, and I were guests in his home. And when my novel, Mumbo Jumbo, was published, he sent me the original front page newspaper account of the Jim Jeffries-Jack Johnson fight. The headline in the 1911 paper was, "Jeff knocked out." Now, I think a lot of white writers, you knew I was going to get to that, right? This guy on the weekend said, if you really want to get a soft Ishmael read, watch him play Love for Sale by Cole Porter on YouTube. So I'm trying not to be hard. But anyway, I think a lot of white writers coast along in whiteness. The cultures of others are only acceptable if it has a sort of white endorsement. A commentator said that if it were not for Leadbelly, there'd be no Eric Clapton. And my response in the Times was that one could imagine Leadbelly pounding rocks on a chain gang and thinking to himself, I really have to endure this because without me, there'll be no Eric Clapton. I recently read the reading list of some of the most famous writers who teach school, and Donald Barthelme was the only writer who listed writers who weren't white. So you have to really admire Ezra Pound, Amy Lowell, and even T.S. Eliot for reaching beyond something called Western civilization, which without Muslim scholars and poets wouldn't exist. Yeah. Richard Wright and Richard Brautigan's interest in Japanese writing led to my becoming a world-class writer instead of just another token minority writer subject to the whims of the Anglo establishment, tolerated until replaced by another token or ostracized after defying the sponsors who were responsible for their success. This is what happened to Richard Wright and James Baldwin. This is what happened to Bell Hooks, who said that her feminist sponsors were uncomfortable with her bringing up the issue of racism all the time. My last novel, Juice, went where minority writers aren't permitted to go. That's okay because the best review came from China. The syndicated columnist in his Hatchet job said I'd gone too far. My answer was, you don't know how far I've gone. Two of my books were published in Montreal, and one was called Going Too Far. A couple of years ago, two books that included the works of over 40 Nigerian writers, edited by Carla Blank in between her collaborations with Robert Wilson and directing a Pakistani play at the Kennedy Center. The two books, one entitled Short Stories by Nigerian Women, were sold to the Egyptian Center of Translation to be translated into Arabic. For some, Richard Brautigan was this monster who played around with guns, the cartoon version, or who drank too much, or insulted his hosts. I never saw that side of Richard Brautigan. He was always talking about Ianthe, his daughter, very tenderly. I remember that time when you were a child and you pointed out to Richard that he and I were on the same plane going to New York. But when the smoke and gossip is cleared, he will be ranked with innovators like Picasso and John Coltrane. He helped to free me of the chains that are applied to the so-called minority writer. He was a white man who listened. You know, Richard Wright wrote a book called White Man Listen, like grabbing people by the lapels. Please listen. It's a very conciliatory book asking for an alliance between the emerging African intelligentsia and intelligentsia of the West. The FBI couldn't get beyond the title, White Man Listen. But he was a white man who listened. I once gave Richard a copy of Clotel, or The President's Daughter, which was published by the first black male novelist in 1853. Did he refuse the book with the kind of sneers that we get from the know-it-all nicks? Did he call it an exercise in political correctness, that phrase that the right has borrowed from the Communist Party? The next time I saw Richard, he was quoting from the novel. Thank you very much.
Catherine Hughes. Is Catherine Hughes here? Catherine Hughes, are you here? Thank you.
Thank you. I must say I was very moved by the video. I knew Richard for many years when I was married to Ron Lowenson, and there was always a tacit understanding that we didn't talk about Richard's upbringing and his youth. That was like a closed door. It always seemed to me as if he invented himself when he came to San Francisco. He was this new person, and I think it was interesting that he and Ron published that little piece called Change. This is a fresh new time in his life. I also wanted to say we tried very hard to get Ron here tonight, and I'm very sorry to say that he is quite ill, and he would like to be here. I think he'd like me to correct something that was in Hortzberg's book, and I'll get to that in a minute. I wanted to say that one of the things that always struck me was how fiercely loyal Ron and Richard were and how close they were over many years. Richard told Ron a lot of things I don't think he told anyone else, and I think didn't he make him the executor of his will? They trusted each other very deeply. When Ron and I were breaking up, I was driving up towards Berkeley. I was on Telegraph, I think, near the underpass, or the on-ramp, and Richard was loping along the side of the road. I stopped and said, "Would you like a ride?" And he looked me right in the eye and said, "No, I wouldn't do that to Ron." And it really hurt me at the time, but in retrospect, I understand that was part of that loyalty and attachment they had to each other. But I was hurt because of all the years we had Richard over many, many times for dinner. We would hang out at Vanessi's, I think, wasn't that his favorite restaurant in North Beach, and run around there. We visited him in Bolinas and had some fun times at Smiley's Bar, I think it was called, up there. And so I have a lot of fond memories. The one thing I wanted to say, trying to sum up Richard is really impossible. I thought the irreverent, dry wit was a good way of looking at it in one way. The word droll also came to me. I remember we'd be sitting around the table and someone would say something mildly amusing. Richard would grab hold of it, and pretty soon it would be bandying around the table. Everybody would be adding to it, but Richard would say the funniest things and put this little twist on it. And then there was the night when we made the mistake of getting this small duck for dinner. I remember there was this little duck for 4 people. And Richard thought it was so funny that we thought this duck could feed 4 people. He would not let go of that all evening. It was like always the duck kept coming up, the duck. But anyway, I was thinking about that he had a certain obsessiveness, and that was part of his greatness as a writer, that he could take hold of an idea and play with it in many different modes. And on the dark side, later I remember sitting up with him many a night. Ron would get fed up with listening to him, and he'd go to bed, and Richard would drink, I think, a whole 5th by himself of bourbon and talk until 3 or 4 in the morning. But it was a fun time, an interesting time, and I miss him too, and I know Ron really misses him, and I'm sorry he can't be here tonight. So thank you.
Is Tony Dingman in the house? Tony Dingman? No. Diamond Dave, are you here? Step right up. Diamond Dave was there. He was at the place, Blabbermouth Night, and he's gonna tell it.
Hey, brothers and sisters, I think I'm here for a couple snapshots. Arising on a conversation we had at the Jack Michelin event a few months ago. Is that right, brother? First one. This tall, skinny, painfully shy, blonde guy with glasses, 1957. Blabbermouth Night. I knew him first on because his girlfriend was from Minneapolis, from muscle front, and they brought me up to this. They were living in this cottage on the top of Telegraph Hill. I remember that. But the memory I want to share with you was Blabbermouth Night. Blabbermouth Night was just started by Lyle Tollefson from Harmony, Minnesota. The first open mic, as far as I know, at the place. Now a legendary spot. A small but legendary spot, and there was Richard Brautigan. This tall, skinny, painfully guy on the balcony. It was a balcony, and it was a small place, but it was packed with people. And he got up there, and this poem. And I can almost remember it almost by word today, all these years later, 1957. It was a poem about what? It was about pissing in the sink, something everybody had done in one of the hotels around North Beach where people were staying $10 a week. It might have been the Dante, it might have been the Swiss American, it might have been the Golden Eagle, one of those hotels. And he nailed it in 5 lines. I wish I had it in front of you right now to talk it. And then second, let's go 10 years. 10 years in which I spent a couple years on a kibbutz when I was 21 on a kibbutz in Israel, where I traveled the world and got back to San Francisco just in time to help kick off the hippie movement. 1966. One of the differences, the beats and the hippies I know now, I can see now, probably is that the beats, the hippies were much more commune. The communes, we had Peter Coyote, he talks about in Sleep Where I Fall, the communes started up and down Highway 101 when the hate fell apart. Now the base is the marijuana business, see? They can keep you down only so long, and then you flourish. And there, with the Diggers, this was brought back when I see Peter Coyote, was Peter Cohen then. They're hanging out, they had a commune. This is the Diggers. The free store, feeding people in the Panhandle. I was there. And then that commune on Cole Street, anybody knew it? Between Carl and Haight Street, where these folks live. I'm talking about the Peters, Peter Cohen, later Peter Coyote, Peter Berg, Diane DiPrima, the woman who wrote the Love Book. Who was that? Eleanor, thank you. Let's have a little participation. That was a place. And there, flamboyantly speaking, the Confederate general, my God, how elegant, how special, was no longer this skinny, long, your father, this long, skinny, painfully shy, drink of water. There's the Richard Brautigan of the Beat era, but now the aristocrat, the Confederate general, who was part of that commune with the Diggers, Peter Coyote, Peter Berg, Diane DiPrima, and Lenore Cannell, and so many others, right there on Cole Street. Do I have it right? Can anybody say that's right? Well, if you're there, just saying it. If you remember that, then you can say it. But anyway, so that's what I have, just to cut to the chase and say we're still here now. And it's so amazing. 1957, 1967, and now what is it? 2014. And here we be, right here in this elegant chamber, talking about Richard Brautigan. Oh, my goodness. What else can I have to say? Thanks a lot, brothers and sisters. So good to be here.
Thanks, Dave. Caden Slow, are you here? Caden Slow. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I represent the Ianthe generation, I guess. I grew up with Ianthe. We were raised since we were infants, so I had just a couple of recollections of Richard. One was going out for ice creams and how tremendously exciting that was when we were 6. Just unbelievably exciting. I still remember that. And then I remember that when we were teenagers and he was famous in the 70s, I guess, he was a really fun, famous person to be around because he really enjoyed it. And because he had a really great sense of finely attuned sense of theater, and I think he really enjoyed being famous. At the same time, he didn't seem to take it seriously, and it was sort of like he was playing along with it, okay, and they were going to find out he wasn't who they said he was, but he was just going to, yeah, I'm famous, and, you know, I'm Richard Brautigan. Anyway, mostly what I wanted to say is, it's been 30 years since he passed, and I was thinking about what has he missed out on. And I don't think he really missed out on the 70s, well, I mean, he didn't miss out on the 70s. The 80s, I don't think he really missed out on. The 90s, I'm not sure how he would have felt about the 90s, but I think he really would have loved the 21st century. I think the way iconic images, and Richard really had a beautiful sense of iconic images, Willard and the Magic Bowling Trophies, which is just so powerful in its ridiculousness. Anyway, I think that fits in well to the 21st century, and mostly, I think Richard would have loved Twitter. I really do. And I just wanted to say that But what I hope that he would do on Twitter is what David Meltzer says, which is to subvert corporate institutional languages, which is so great that you said that. And in fact, I had this fantasy that he would subvert Twitter's corporate institutional languages, and that he would subvert it by tweeting things like, I ate a dish of ice cream that looked like Kafka's hat. Or, yeah, she's beautiful, but burn all the maps to your body. I'm not here of my own choosing. And finally, I live in the American Hotel, said the wino, and I can remember dinosaurs. Thank you.
All right. So not everyone could be here today, so we have V. Vale here.
I got a job at City Lights bookstore because my father and my uncle were both beatniks, and at City Lights you could meet anybody who was a so-called beat, and most of the visiting writers in town. And one of those writers that came in regularly that I tried to befriend was Richard Brautigan, and our relationship since I was younger was he talked and I listened. And sometimes to improve his morale, I would take his stack of books, which were often by the cash register in those days, because he was quite popular, and I'd move it to a more favored spot. I think he liked that. Even though I spent hours with Richard Brautigan, I have to ask of any writer, how original are they? And I concluded that Richard Brautigan is an American surrealist, but surrealism light. Or you could say he invented his own brand of American surrealism without even knowing what French surrealism was. And then if you read closely what he wrote, it's very dark humor mixed with also very light humor. It's a very strange amalgam. And also when you think of how a writer will endure far into the future, I mean, I always ask several questions like, is it deeply meaningful? Is it deeply humorous? Is it deeply beautiful? Is it deeply prophetic? And I feel that Richard Brautigan was prophetic. I mean, we're in the age of this ruled by Apple technology right now, in which any word you can ever think of, you can put a small I in front of it, and it somehow becomes associated with Apple technology. And I looked at Richard Brautigan's book In Watermelon Sugar, and he had invented the concept of small I, capital D, I, death. But he's always very funny. I remember once we also took a drive out to Marin County. I don't remember who was driving, but I was surprised that he knew the names of things like acacia trees, which are a beautiful shade of yellow in Marin. He knew names of plants, and I was very impressed by that because I wanted to be a writer too. And then I suppose the highlight of our relationship was we were both had contiguous birthdays, and we shared a birthday party in the apartment where I lived, which is on the same level as the apartment of Valerie Estes. Her entrance was on the other side of the street, but the building ran between Genoa Alley and Kearney Street, and since we were both on the same levels, we had this birthday party together, and a few notables who showed up were Janis Joplin and Michael McClure and other friends of Richard's. He knew a lot of people, and I remember Janis getting drunk, and somehow there was this terrible sound of breaking glass and laughter and all that. And so this is all by luck, mind you, that I got hired by City Lights and could have a relationship with Richard there, and that we shared the same birthday party. that was it. That's my Richard Brautigan story.
My name is Herbert Gold. We hung out a little together. I wasn't much of a drinker, and he took up drinking in earnest. He gave me, I visited him in one of his apartments in North Beach. He gave me a framed Coke bottle top with, the title was The Oldest Living, it was a rusty Coke bottle top, The Oldest Living Coke bottle top, and it was probably a duplicate of one because he had one of, I know, on his wall. I think it was just his jokiness coming out and his whimsy coming out. And the problem with him was as he aged, and as he was for a while very famous and very in, and people talked about him a lot. And it inevitably happens with any writer, with Nabokov, or even, great novelists like Nabokov or Bellow or Soroyan, whom I admire a lot. They go through ups and downs, and sometimes there's a period of down in old age, or in middle age, or in early age. Sometimes, anyway, he went through a down period. His romances turned bad, many of them. He drank a great deal. Well, he was the really emblematic hippie poet. He was probably the best, the most, and there were dimensions to him. There was the touchingness, the sentiment about the past, the desire for the freedom that the hippies aspired to. I remember when I was, around the time I was seeing quite a lot of Richard, I was friendly with Allen Ginsberg. Allen and I went to school together at Columbia. We were walking down an alley near where there's a police station now in North Beach. You could hear the rolling sound of a mimeograph. This was, of course, way before photocopies or Xerox or anything like that. And it was from an open window, a couple of flights up. And Alan pointed to it and said, "There must be a poet up there." And Richard was one of the poets. It wasn't Richard's place, but he was one of the poets. He sold poetry on the street.
And with that, we're going to return to, we're going to have the panel come forward now. So Bob Hass is our poet laureate, needs no introduction, but he is going to be immoderating the poets tonight, who will include Joanne Kyger, David Meltzer, and Michael McClure.
I didn't know Richard. I heard him read on a couple of occasions, and once when I had my first teaching job at the State University of New York at Buffalo, he came to read. Bob Creeley was out of town, and he asked me if I would take Richard to Niagara Falls, and I was thrilled, of course, that I was going to get to meet him. And I went to his hotel, and I knocked on the door, and I said, "I'm here to take you to Niagara Falls." And he said, "I don't want to go." Which kind of settled the matter. And as I was walking away, I thought about his poems and thought, I guess he'd rather imagine it. There's a poem by Basho about Japanese poets who are supposed to go to see Mount Fuji, and Basho's poem on that subject is a bit like a Richard poem because it goes, foggy day, can't see Fuji. Interesting. What's interesting tonight is to have 2 or 3 of Richard's friends, his compatriots in that electric and exciting time in San Francisco. Joanne Kyger arrived in the city from UC Santa Barbara in 1957. She was immediately one of the, I was trying to find the adjective, seminal, necessary, radiant, crucial poets of the emerging literary scene. She and Gary Snyder married, went to Japan in 1960. She traveled with Gary and Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky in India and came back and published her first book, The Tapestry and the Web, in 1965. She's the author of more than 20 books. Best Way In is her extraordinary collected poems About Now, and Strange Big Moon, the delicious, sharp-witted book about her experience of traveling around Japan and India with Ginsberg and Snyder. David Meltzer also arrived in San Francisco in 1957, came by way of Brooklyn, where he was a child radio star, I think I have that right, and Los Angeles. He's a jazz guitarist, a scholar of the Kabbalah, as well as a poet and the author of more than 50 books of poetry and prose. Best Way In is David's copy, the selected poems. Two-Way Mirror, the poetry notebooks forthcoming from City Lights. San Francisco Beat, a book of conversations and interviews about the San Francisco poetry scene. And his amazing anthologies done in the 80s, two powerful and useful human books on the subjects of birth and death, published in the 1980s by North Point Press. Michael McClure was born in Kansas, grew up in Seattle, and arrived in San Francisco by 1955. He was one of the readers at the legendary Six Gallery reading in San Francisco in 1956. He published his first book of poems in that year. Gallery reading was 55 in 1955. October 1955. Since then, he has published 8 books of plays, 4 collections of essays, and 13 more books of poems. He was described by Allen Ginsberg's biographer Barry Mills as the prince of the San Francisco scene. He collaborated with the Doors keyboardist Ray Manzarek on writing Mercedes-Benz for Janis Joplin. He's received numerous literary awards, including an Obie, and for our purposes, he's a close friend of Richard Brautigan, and in the years when they were both young poets in the Haight-Ashbury. And Michael has written what is not only one of Michael McClure's best essays, which is saying a lot, but a remarkable piece of writing about that friendship called
91
things about Richard Brautigan, which you can get online. If you just go to Brautigan McClure, it comes right up. And it would be to have the taste of this evening after this evening, it would be a great experience. So welcome these amazing folks.
Thank you, Robert.
I'm going to read from some prepared notes briefly. If I don't read from them, you might just find me with my jaw hanging open in the middle of a reminiscence. I remember Richard Brautigan, the early days. I remember when I first met Richard Brautigan. It's the spring of 1957, a few months after I arrived in San Francisco up from Santa Barbara. He's with Ron Lowenson at a Helen Frankenthaler opening at the East-West Gallery. They tell me they're poets. They are both very young, like 19 or 20. Ron likes Wordsworth, and I make fun of his choice. Wordsworth is so old-fashioned. I was just up from Ezra Pound. Richard asked for my address, and I give it to him. I'm right over at La Rocca's Bar on Columbus Avenue. He shows up the next night and suggests we go to dinner. Only he doesn't have any money, which means I take him. He shows me this basement in Chinatown where dishes are 39 cents each. Then we go to Grant Avenue where we run into Mike Nathan, a very young artist who has painted the picture hanging in City Light's window, a priest and a policeman standing side by side with deadpan expressions. Mike wants to show me North Beach, but Richard isn't happy with this and spends the rest of the evening following a half a block behind. He maintains a somewhat moody distance during the next 2 years whenever I run into him in North Beach. Then he gets married to Ginny Alder, and they have a daughter, Ianthe. Coming back in the winter of 1964 from Japan, where I had lived for 4 years, I meet Richard again, and he is almost a different person. He and Ron Lowenson started a magazine called Change in 1963. I had sent them some poems. The magazine is modest, stapled publication with a very solemn picture of Richard and Ron on the cover. 25 cents a copy. For $255, you could get it for 85 years. But only one copy ever was published. Also, when I was still in Japan, some sections of his book, Trout Fishing in America, were published in the Evergreen Review, which I thought were hilarious. I read them standing up in a bus in Kyoto and made a great commotion, laughing out loud and stared at, very unreserved. I wrote Richard when I returned to tell him how much I liked his writing. We were communicating again. Although he was never part of any literary establishment, he did have the friendship and attention of Jack Spicer in North Beach. They were both born on January 30th, fellow Aquarians. Spicer gave him invaluable help going over the manuscript as it emerged, talking with him about it. Spicer considered it a great poem. Spicer also introduced him to his future publisher, Don Allen. Eventually, Trout Fishing in America sold way over 2 million copies. During the winter of '64, we started to see each other frequently in North Beach. We became tremendous Beatles fans, writing them a fan letter at Vesubio's bar. They never answered the letter, but I'm not sure if we mailed it. Richard moves out to Bolinas for a short time on the then very empty Mesa in a house Bob Kelly Jones is building for Mel Wax. There's a Greyhound bus that gets him there. It arrives in the evening and leaves in the morning. 1964 Bolinas is very quiet, a handful of houses, no liquor store. It was a beauty parlor. The bar too scary and rednecky to go into. He starts writing In Watermelon Sugar on May 13th, 1964, when he's 29 years old, and finishes it on July 19th, 1964, in the front room at 123 Beaver Street, a house where he was sharing for a while with Philip Whalen and Lou Welch. While he was writing it, he phones and reads long sections out loud to me. It is magical and serene. He later does a public reading at Buzz Gallery in July, a year later, 1965, and 2 performances a week apart while the Berkeley Poetry Conference is going on across the bay, which he wasn't invited to. Talk about part, he was not part of that literary establishment. Later, it's published by Don Allen in 1968 by Four Seasons Press. Meanwhile, back in 1964, Richard is nominated for the Formentor Prize for the upcoming publication of The Confederate General from Big Sur by Grove Press. This is a very famous $10,000 international award, and Richard thought he had a chance to win it. He would be catapulted into fame, and everything would change for him, just like what happened to Kerouac. Thrown to the media, becoming an instant success. He always reminded me, this might be the last time we can talk like this. Or meet and see each other over the markdown meat at the local Safeway. Richard was then living a few blocks away from me with his new girlfriend, Janice, but he didn't get the prize. And after an embarrassed few weeks, we resumed our telephone conversations in which he talked about himself and whatever he was absorbed in at the moment, and I listened. In 1965, there was the first big publication party for a Confederate general from Big Sur, hosted by publisher Grove Press. This is his big party. Don Allen arranges it all. A reading at the California Club on Clay Street, and a reception afterwards with an open bar from 10 to 12 at the Tape Music Center on the Divisadero. A Confederate General is really Richard's second book, but being published first before Trout Fishing. Tom Parkinson from the English department at UC Berkeley does a review for this SF Chronicle, his first big review. He says the prose has qualities of Gertrude Stein, Sherwood Anderson. Fact and fraud and wild whimsy are all reported with an air of detachment, and the author has the potentiality of Soroyan and brings American humor a new and disturbing voice. Disturbing? February's 1965, McCall's magazine runs a picture and a piece on a page called Sight and Sound. Quote, "Not since Jack Kerouac hit the famous road has there been an eloquent spokesman for the Beat generation. In fact, we thought they had all grown up. But here comes Richard Brautigan, 29, with a Confederate general in Big Sur, a wildly original fictional fantasy, somehow telling all about what makes the Beats tick, their bravado, pathos, and especially their laughter. P.S. If liberal use of four-letter words offends you in a novel, Mr. Brautigan is definitely not for your bookshelf." That was his first big magazine he was published in. I leave for a year in Europe and one in New York City, and when I return in 1967, Richard had become the favorite and best-known poet in San Francisco. But now, the summer of love is over, and Richard takes me to the Haight to see a parade called the Death of the Hippie, a mock funeral procession with a coffin. I miss the whole Richard hippie fame thing in San Francisco. After that, I moved to Bolinas, and Richard becomes worldly. There's a big party at the San Francisco Zen Center for his 40th birthday. Dick Baker, who was then Roshi, arranges it for the Zen Center kitchen to cater a meal of beef Wellington and important wines. Jerry Brown is there, and Robert Duncan, Jim Harrison, and Harry Dean Stanton. Price Dunn and Margot Doss lock themselves in the bathroom for half an hour. Ron Lowenson and I sit on the stairs waiting to use it. Dr. John is away in India. Richard was always able to maintain that iconic persona. He remained picaresque and always a master of the metaphor and the simple sentence without literary pretensions. As one critic said, a gift from the West Coast to the rest of the nation.
Poet and critic Bill Berkson visited Yale in the 60s. He asked what everyone was reading and found they were reading Richard Brautigan. Earlier in the 60s, Richard visited me almost every day in our hillside Haight-Ashbury flat. Richard was almost a member of the family being my wife and daughter at the time. Everyone was poor in those days, except in friends and sharing art and writing. Brautigan and I would read each other poems or thoughts, or he would describe scenes from films that he doted on. And we wrote funny stories jokingly dedicated to each other and drank sweet wine. He lived a short walking distance over on Geary Street near Stanyon Street in a flat as bare of possessions as my place. Shortly after I began teaching at CCAC, California College of Arts and Crafts, I invited Richard to the art college to give a reading of his work. The one-of-a-kind poster was my hand drawing and modeled after boxing posters of the time. On the left side of the poster, Richard's head faced forward in glasses, hat, and mustache. On the right side of the poster was his profile. Under one head, I lettered poet and digger under the other. Richard took that poster home and kept it on his wall forever, along with other posters and good notices. He'd hang new things, but never take anything away or down. Things around him comforted him, and they became like a cobwebby museum of his triumphs and successes and good notices. The art students at the college listened carefully to Richard's soothing and smiling voice and were charmed by this taste of the movement that was beginning to happen happen across the bay in Frisco. He was a delight and brought news to them. Richard's style of dress was exact, and he did not want to change it. He was a shabby dandy, loose threads at the cuff, black pants faded to gray, an old mismatched vest, a used navy pea jacket, and something like love beads around his neck. He became active in the Diggers, the anarchist, idealist social movement in the Haight. The Diggers were begun by Peter Coyote, Emmett Grogan, and Peter Berg when they split from the Marxist mime troupe. Diggers spread the idea of free. They gathered leftover vegetables and food and meat from the markets and took them to their kitchen and made them into meals which they passed out in Golden Gate Park to anyone hungry. The district was overpopulated with young people from all over the U.S. Diggers gathered and cleaned wearable clothing for the Digger Free Store. They promoted a medical clinic in the Haight, Ashbury. They made pronouncements, sometimes from their movable stage, which was called the free frame of reference. Richard often worked on Haight Street, passing out handbills from the Diggers Communications Company. He grinned broadly and warmly as he did so. He enjoyed being there, and some of the handouts were his poems. Later, after Richard's meteor of success in his planning of each new book or story, he became a Confederate general scheming a campaign. He had to go over every detail endlessly. Sometimes he phoned me half a dozen times in a day to talk about a cover photo he was thinking up. He became even more obsessive about contract details. It was maddening, painful, and dull. He'd sweat whether to accept a book advance of $60,000 or whether to negotiate on for $65,000. He'd torture out the advertising details of the book. It was endless and painful for his friends who were supporting him emotionally, but were themselves in near poverty. You wanted to help. Richard needed help, but he needed to cause pain with his success. Contrary-wise, Richard presented a novel and a book of plays of mine to his publisher and pressed for their acceptance. And they were handsomely published and appeared simultaneously. I didn't get anything like the front money that Richard got. Nor did I deserve it as he did after selling God knows how many copies of Trout. To change from Richard's life to his art. I will first visit his visionary book-length prose poem in Watermelon Sugar. It was, like Trout Fishing in America, disguised as a novel. The tigers in the tigers in Watermelon Sugar are surely Blake's Tigers of Wrath, wherein Blake says, the tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. The tigers have beautiful voices, and the nameless hero asks them for aid in his math problems. The world of Ianthe is the interwound topology of the primal material. The Sears Roebuck store on the corner, half a block up the hill from Richard on Geary Street at the corner of Stanyon, is no doubt the forgotten works in Watermelon Sugar. In Watermelon Sugar might have been written by an American Federico Garcia Lorca, with the darkness of Lorca's most visionary poems, and as in his Divan at Tamarit. Nobody understood the perfume of the dark magnolia of your womb, quote unquote. Brautigan abolishes the reality of conflict in his novels by the changing from chapter to chapter. One could see the chapters as panels. I'm reminded of the newspaper cartoons of his childhood and mine, because I also grew up in Seattle. Tunerville, probably you've never heard of these. Tunerville Trolley. Yeah. Smoky Stover. Yeah. Did you get them in the newspapers? Wow. Tunerville Trolley, Smoky Stover, and the Nutt Brothers Chess and Wall. Because of the swift, surprising changes, I remember dancing at the Fillmore in early days of rock, taking the partner that appears next to you, perhaps Jean Harlow, Mae West, Florence Nightingale, Cleopatra. She has a faint smell of marijuana on her breath. And perhaps you have had a whiff of a dizzying drug. You're putting your foot down to the Jefferson Airplane or Big Brother. There are light shows streaming on the walls. Step, turn, surprise. There's another partner. Remembering Richard's face, as I've seen him reciting the tiny poem Horse Child Breakfast from his book, The Pill versus the Springhill Mine Disaster. His face is a theater of the warm, honey-flowing pleasure of recollection, eyes bright yet soft and remembering, highlighted by mustache and wire rims. Sometimes Richard's poetry is called surreal, but no more than Sappho or a Chinese lyric of the Tang Dynasty, or a song by the Mamas and Papas. It is lucid. The young woman looks like a horse to Richard. She has long, sleek legs and a palomino mane. Richard sees her as a blonde horse child, a filly. She stays the night, and they have breakfast together, which she probably fixes. It's not easy to imagine Richard fixing breakfast. She becomes horse child breakfast, and Richard addresses her in that way. It is a love poem, owing much to Richard's imagination of Sappho's lyrics. A lucid, sensual, and sensory address to another person. At one time, Richard had the idea of translating part of the Greek anthology. That's all.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I can't, but it's all right. I'm talking.
Can you hear back there?
Can you hear?
Could you move that up?
Is this better? No, is this?
Yeah.
I'm all right. I'm putting the microphone on my Adam's apple, and I am now going to communicate as best as I can to you about Richard Brautigan, which is, as everyone indicates, there's so much to say and not enough. Ultimately, what? No? Thank you. Oh, strangers in the night. This is like one of these dreaded memory lane tours, these boat tours where they have the old rock bands in ill-fitting spandex and, and stuff going. But I remember meeting Richard about that same time in '57. We were both the same age, both Aquarians. Of course, we didn't know the age was right around the corner at that point. And more than anything, I was a poet, and Richard wrote poetry, but was really more interested in prose and in fiction. And I remember so many times in those soaring conversations in the bars, talking about various novelists and short story writers. And of course, Hemingway was that crucial landmass that so many American writers of that generation and subsequent ones had to contend with. We talked about that. I remember we got into a big argument about James Jones's From Here to Eternity. I thought it was very interesting. He didn't like it because it was so sprawling, which speaks to his sense of economy, which he always had, and you could see it in the early poems. I mean, Joanne and I and Michael, there were these Sunday salons, weren't they, at Joe Dunn's?
Joe Dunn's house.
That's right, Joe Dunn's house, and the kind of, and they were presided over by these two poetry bulwarks, Robert Duncan and Jack Spicer. And for a young poet, you couldn't really contend with a better opposition than those two fellows, really. So we learned a lot, and Richard would come in a lot of times to these. And I remember he trying to seek Spicer's acknowledgement of his poetic gifts. And Jack, who was another one who cut to the chase, said, "No, you're a prose writer. I mean, that's what you do best. That's it." And I always felt Richard was very disheartened by that. I mean, and I don't want to go Freudian, God forbid, but probably father issues. I mean, this comes to mind. Anyway, we would talk about writing. That seemed to be the passion. And then we'd drink. And there would come a time in the drinking where, like many other people I knew, you'd reach a zone. Some would, just the nature of their alcoholism, would reach a zone. And there would be this transformation of character that would occur. And it was startling initially, because here we were, these sort of dreamy writer types, and then all of a sudden the switch would turn on, and then Richard would become somebody else, and would become negative and nasty and contentious. I was talking to Bob about the two types of drunks that I've known, and not just in the writing community, just in general. Because I know a lot of drunks, and and I drink myself, and get drunk. But there were either like the happy drunks. They just drink and they just smile more and more, and ultimately their face would be on the bar counter and they'd just be like in paradise. But then there would be the angry drunk. And that was something you didn't know. It was like this snake, that would suddenly be at you. And my experience with so many of my friends and mentors who drank badly was that these folks would pick fights when they got to a certain stage with people that they knew would beat the shit out of them. Now, again, I don't want to go Freudian, but there was something interesting to that, in that. And they would often get themselves really hurt by people that they picked fights on. I know this is not pleasant. But, you know, and of course, we were talking at one point about the viciousness of fame, about the inability of so many writers and artists and musicians to comprehend it and to deal with it, and ultimately become sort of destroyed by it. I mean, there are classic examples like Kerouac, all he too. You see, the point is we all wanted to write. Just wanted to sit home and tappa, tappa, tappa like that, and these things would stack up, and there would be a book, and so forth. But then I remember Kenneth Rexroth telling me in his stentorian tones, told me, beware of the embrace. I didn't know what he was talking about because I was sort of, I lived under the radar, you know. I just wanted to peck, peck, peck. But I understood what he meant because he too, in his time, had seen the fame and embrace in such a way that you too, like the drink that turned you sour, would transform people. I mean, I have, I don't want to rhapsodize, but I have wonderful, you know, memories, even in Bolinas, when Richard, our family at the time was living in this rental house on, what's it, Overlook? Terrace. This sort of 3-story, looked like a chalet, for crying out loud, you know, top of the world, Ma. I mean, you know, there we were. We were renting it for a period of time from Mr. Parsons, a hay merchant from Yolo County. Very nice guy who had actually built the place for his kids who were going to college for like summer frat follies. So we were getting set to go, and Richard, I guess, I don't know how he found out, but he wanted to buy the house because Mr. Parsons was putting it on the market. And that was fine. I mean, so we, and in the spirit of all of us, we invited Richard over for dinner. And Richard came over with a gallon jug that was a quarter drunk already, and then put it on the table, and we had this great dinner, and then as is the wont, wandered off to Smiley's, the pub in Bolinas, and had some more, and again, the transformation. But it's been said that Richard threw us out. But he didn't. We were going out, and we were happy that somebody we knew was taking over the place. So we couldn't understand what a bachelor, you know, at that time would want with this enormous structure, with like a bedroom in the basement, and then this huge living room, and this massive kitchen, and this little room, and then rooms upstairs. But it was great for the kids. We had 3. So, I mean, I'm sorry to be so disconnected, but it often happens. You know, as you get into advanced geezerdom, you know, the slickness of the chronological spiel sort of disintegrates, you know, and turns into this weird memory confetti, you know, it just goes all over the place. So anyway, thank you for your patience.
So we have a stretch of time for audience questions, but
We'd rather you gave the questions.
I was interested in Tom McGuane's take from the Midwest or from Montana, wherever he was then, that this figure suddenly appeared out of the what people were calling the hippie movement to crystallize that culture and become an icon of it. And I think that was part of my sense of what happened. But I knew Ron in those days. I didn't know Richard, and I'm very curious about how, as one of my students said, she was writing a paper about the beat hippie cusp. that somehow, somewhere between Jack Spicer and Joe Dunn's Salon and the Diggers, Richard perfected this art. To me, Michael analyzing it, to me, the really extraordinary book is in Watermelon Sugar, and hearing your stories about the mix of sweetness and darkness in him makes that phrase in Watermelon Sugar gorgeous and scary, both. How do you account for his art? Do you?
Now, really, that is a kind of question that is impossible. That is an impossible. How does it, Michael? How do you account for your art? You know, Joanne, your art. I mean, how do you account for it?
You know, I know.
Art.
I know no one can ever.
I don't know. I would answer that. How do you account for Picasso?
Yeah, I know that no one can account for their own, but from the outside, especially.
I was talking about Brautigan, not me.
Yeah. I know that from the outside, sometimes you saw the poems early, and you saw the way the work developed. Joanne, you talked as if it kind of flowed naturally out of the temperament of the young poet that you knew.
Well, I think he was a real craftsman. You know, he was very careful with his language. He was very careful with his writing. He practiced his language, and he did it outside of some help with Spicer without the, quote, literary establishment. I mean, he just arrived fully formed in some way. But I think he wrote every day. You know, he was, observed his writing. So I think it was something that came from his own practice.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. No matter where he was emotionally, he would write every day, in the best of times and in the worst of times, and because, like, just getting back to this leitmotif, all we wanted to do was just write. Just life intervened, you know, and so.
There's a story. And I believe this. There's a story, and I can't remember where I heard it. I don't think Richard told me. But the story is that he rewrote sections of Trout Fishing in America 16 times.
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
And I believe it.
Yeah,
but I
do
can't
too,
remember who told me or where I read it. But
Yeah.
that's the kind of.
Right, there's somebody else, I mean, like a friend of his and Lou Welch's, Don Carpenter.
Oh, yeah.
Who was another writer. I mean, and another writer that was working for precision, for economy, for honesty. That was something, and in a way, I don't know if that's Hemingway's, do you think? I mean, the true, honest, brave, you know, that sort of stuff. But really, the care for language and the care for getting it down and getting it right, according to each writer's particular standard of what they were doing at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, he was very much in control of his language and his words, and to get that really easy, offhand, simple tone was something that was achieved by paring a lot away, I guess.
There are moments when that poem that was shown on the short poem that was shown in sections on the screen, there are moments when I don't remember that poem. I guess it was from, not Please Plant This, I don't even know what it's from. I don't remember it. But there are moments as I watched that on the screen, and I felt like my heart was going to just lift up and float away. It was so beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's early.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
before he came to here, to San Francisco in 57.
Either before or slightly after the mental institution.
Yeah. And is the
So
audience?
we have time for some questions from the audience.
Yes.
Are his early works collected, published, or anything before Trout?
It's a good idea.
The question is whether there's been a collected works published. No, I think is the answer. Library of America ought to do a volume. Yeah.
Actually, there is the Edna Webster collection of Richard Brautigan's Juvenilia. It was sold to the library, and there is an edition of it. It's a small press edition, but yeah, a number of those pieces are in print.
Here? Sold to where?
Bancroft?
I forget the name of the publisher that brought it out, but it was discovered in the late 1980s, I believe, and the papers are here. They are archived at Bancroft Library, and there was an edition of the Juvenilia issued as well. Yeah.
When you read these short poems of Richard's, there's a whole series of them. Little mimeograph collections mostly. They are ingenious and ingeniously beautiful the way they move organismically from place to place, and then there's the changeover in between the small books of poetry that there is in the novels, or in what I call prose poems. The same change that there is from one to the other is in those little tiny, perfect books of poetry that you could have looked at in the day they were brought out in their editions of 40 copies or 50, I don't know. And that's it.
Are they extant or are they lost?
They're extant, but they're out of print, I'm sure.
Are they?
They must have them here.
No, they exist. I mean, they're very rare. They're very rare collections. I mean, they're extraordinary to have. I don't know. Do you have some of them? Do you have?
No.
They're really lovely, and a lot of them are in the Hill versus the Springhill mine disaster. And one hopes that eventually there'll be an entire collection of all his poetry.
Yeah. But that's not. It's not in the Juvenilia.
Right. No.
Other questions for her?
Yeah. I see a hand.
Does anyone know about Brautigan's education?
The question is, does anyone know about Richard Brautigan's education? Ianthe?
Maybe Ianthe's the answer.
His education, he grew up during. He grew up. He was born in 1935 in the middle of the Depression, and extremely poor. I mean, beyond poor, like no food poor. And so his education was really rough. Sherry Vedder, who's on the cover of Revenge of the Lawn, told me a story recently that, and also, if you notice in the photograph, he doesn't have any glasses on. And he couldn't, so I think part of when he was in school, he literally couldn't see the page. And there was a teacher who just put him in the back of the room for the entire semester. And so he had a very uneasy relationship with school, and moved around a lot. And he told me that like he couldn't. This is back in the day where if somebody interesting came to school, you weren't. And you couldn't. There was a cost to go in, and he said he could never afford those costs. So and he writes about his childhood. You can get little pieces in and out. And then his education was just high school. He graduated from high school, which I didn't know until after his death. He had his high school diploma. And it was at that point, right when he graduated from high school, that his mother told him that his last name was not Porterfield, that his last name was Brautigan. So it was an interesting graduation present. And I asked his mother, I said, Mary Lou, I said, why didn't he go to college? I said, the University of Eugene is right there. And she just held out her empty hands and she said, with what? With what?
Yes.
I'm wondering if his personality was damaged by the electroshock in the
The question is whether his personality was damaged by having gone through electroshock therapy in that mental institution in Washington. I think the answer is no one knows what the effect of that was.
I don't know if I'll be able to speak the way I had to speak, but you know what? We have this program that supports people with mental illness, and they call it Brautigan-Swensen Champions, and I'm proud of it. And then they have this, I don't know what's going on, 1421. Like for treatment. It's not effective yet, but they want to see how it goes and how would it work for people with challenges in life, especially in their mental state of mind, how we could work with them with fairness and humanitarian aspect of treatment.
It's powerful to think that that's happening now, and certainly wasn't. It sounds like it was not available to Richard at that time. Is there the next? Yes.
I never did hear Richard talk about what he liked to read. Actually, I'm thinking this now that. And someone mentioned Stein, and we definitely could hear Richard Stein in his work. I don't think he ever read.
Okay, let me just give you this.
But I also hear Mark Twain in that kind of arch or ironic distance, and I wondered if he might have read Mark Twain or ever mentioned him, since we're right near the Bancroft Library. I
think he liked the way Mark Twain looked, you know.
Yeah.
And he also mentioned a lot that he loved Turgenev. You know, he loved reading Turgenev. So there were authors that he selectively found, and Michael mentioned Sappho's poems, which were those clipped little pieces of speech.
I know he hated Beckett because it came up one night at a dinner party.
Excuse me. Yeah, I'm just kind of paranoid because I'm being watched. But you know what? The problem is, okay, hold on. Would you mind if I read this?
Excuse me, this is not part of our program.
Oh, okay.
Could we proceed with another question, please?
All right, thanks.
John Suter.
Yeah, I have a question about Richard's environmental activism. And I know that Michael and David participated in readings in the late 60s to raise money for ecology action and things like this, and read with Gary. And I was wondering if you could address that, tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's an aspect of him that's been largely forgotten.
Asking Michael McClure about Richard's involvement in environmental action.
Richard's greatest social involvement that I know of was with the Diggers, and he was in with full heart to that. The Diggers were starting I believe in the Springhill Mine Disaster versus the Pill. One of those books has a poem that was a communications company poem of Richard's, which was a poem about the VD clinic. And the Diggers managed to get opened in Haight-Ashbury a free VD clinic. And then the question was getting people in it. And that was one of the jobs of the communication company. That's where I think of Richard being active.
The reading of Lou Welch and Richard at San Quentin.
What about?
Well, it has to be discovered. There must be some kind of recording somewhere.
He did write the menu when he went to San Quentin. He did write what everybody got to eat there, which turned out to be, I can't remember, it was a great deal, but it was really awful. Something along those lines. But he typed out the menu, didn't he? Is that in Trout Fishing?
No, that was in Esquire.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know he wrote that.
Yeah.
We have about 5 more minutes, and I wanted to remind you that Stephen proposed that people who want to continue to talk about Richard might meet at the Jupiter on Shattuck, not far from here. Joanne, do you have a final thought?
Well, one of the wonderful forms of Richard's writing are these very short paragraphs that are chapters. I mean, he is one of the most eloquently pared down, simple writers, in which you really trust his tone. You really trust that Richard, or a voice, is talking to you. When he talks about trout fishing, you believe in those trout, even though he gets out into his surreal moments. So there's a real clarity about his communication that I think really strikes to your heart in some way, in which you realize this is a very unique and simple and direct voice that's talking to you. You don't get lost in the hayfields, whatever that means.
It makes me think of Chekhov saying once that his favorite Russian sentence was written by a kid next to him in 4th grade. He looked under the page and he said, it was, "The sea is large." That was it, right? David, do you have a final thought?
The last word? No. No.
Michael?
Richard has the last word, and really go read him, or go back and read him. Find out why he inspired. My wife was turned on to to poetry by Richard's early poetry collections. He had a tremendous impact on younger people at that time. Now that really means something. And why did that work? Was it just historical? Was it just the social conditions then? I don't think so, because I think now if we go back and read some more, and especially in me and my dotage, we probably will learn more and perhaps really appreciate more of what he did. And all writing is a kind of sacrifice too. So what he gave to us, or gave up for us, is worth evaluating and considering by reading his work.
Michael?
Yeah. Let's turn the last word over to the audience. Are there people in the audience who know a poem of Richard's by heart, and would they recite it?
Negative slang. He'd sell a rat's asshole to a blind man as a wedding ring.
Really?
It's so nice to wake up in the morning and not have to tell someone you love them when you don't love them.
That's a depressing poem.
Ben, are you here? Ben Austin? What'd you say?
He just walked in the door.
Ben, will you recite a poem of Richard's?
Oh, sure. I think it's Star Spangled Nails, and it goes, they gave you some Star Spangled Nails in your coffin, kid. That's what they gave you. What's that?
Joanne Kyger, Michael McClure, David Meltzer, Litquake, Ianthe, and Stephen Brown. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just a reminder before you go, there is a broadside of Richard Brautigan's at the table there by Moe's. It's free. You can pick it up, and you can also buy a book if you are inclined. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This was a wonderful evening. Thank you. Good night.